Hello, so it's a small group today, but I'm excited for everyone to make it. Welcome to this is Unleashed Invaders. So my webinar today on pets that are released into the wild and become invasive species. A little bit what we're going to talk about today. I'm Jessie from EKISC, so the East Kootenay Invasive Species Council. I'm going to share with you guys like a presentation and we can go over some main points. But first I wanted just to give a land acknowledgement that we are grateful to live, work, and play on the traditional lands of the Ktunaxa and Secwepemc people. And good to go. I'm going to share my screen now. Oh, I gotta get you to the first page. Yeah, this is Unleashed Invaders, the unintended consequence of releasing pets into the wild. So we're going to go over some of the commonly released pets in British Columbia, go over some of the ways that they're harming the environment, how they might be harming our economy, and also impacting social systems. So all in all, they are pets becoming invasive species. Biodiversity loss is attributed to their presence. So that's why responsible pet ownership and the informed decisions when choosing your pets is going to be very key here. Management practices for these species once they're entering the environment. We'll go a bit over that. There's a lot of controversy around some of these points, so we will do our best to make sure we're careful in meeting everyone's preferences. So first, I just wanted to explain what is EKISC. We are the East Kootenay Invasive Species Council. We're a regional nonprofit organization that works to mitigate negative environmental, social, and economic impacts of invasive species. So we cover a pretty big region, including like plants, animals, any invasive species present in the region, anything on that British Columbia noxious weed list is what we are most prioritizing in the area. So we're made up of a field crew, which is our like boots on the ground. That's people who are doing management inventories. They are removing the weeds, maybe. They are working with like landowners and that sort of thing to do the invasive species management. I am on the more social, like the education side, the outreach side, along with my coworker. We are summer students, just part of a larger branch of the East Kootenay Invasive Species Council. That includes like the weed pulls, as you see in the photo here. We do things like those webinar, social media, educational content, talking to the community. That includes working with children's groups, education, and community outreach. So we cover, pretty much everywhere through the regional district of the East Kootenay. So in Vermeer Radium, I included this map on here just so you can see how we are organizing all of these areas, because it's such a huge location, and we're located right here. I'm from Cranbrook. Most of us work in Kimberley. Some of us work in Fernie, but we end up doing a lot of traveling, as you imagine. So what are invasive species, right? Like we're such a big organization, like with such a big area, it must be a pretty big problem, these invasive species. So that is referring to any species, any living thing that has been moved by people, usually accidentally, maybe purposefully by humans from one place. So that includes, plants, animals, insects, microorganisms. That could be like bacteria, fungus. It's a pretty wide scope as species, any living thing. So they're threatening economic systems, social systems for humans. they're also impacting our environment in a lot of different ways. So that's why we're worried about them. That's why our government, that's why in BC, we have motivation to work against these invasive species. We can go over some of the ways that they're impacting us in the further slides, but as you see here, maybe like a spawning salmon, we have like our natural systems with the pollinators and the flowers, agriculture, our wildlife, our deer, but then we also have this photo with some like hands that are really maybe irritated. So that might be when someone's interacting with invasives, they might be toxic and can cause skin irritations. So that's one way. Like humans are kind of the most impacted aside from our environment. Like we have a motivation to control these invasive species because it's not only harming us and our wildlife, but also like our agriculture and natural systems of the environment, right? So exotic pets, how are exotic pets maybe tied into this? What do you think of when you hear the name exotic? An invasive species and exotic species might be intertwined in a lot of scenarios, so you might hear those terms together. But to differentiate an exotic species, that's referring to an exotic pet that is like an animal that's taken from one location to a new area, like typically from continent to continent, maybe, where it's still a wild animal and we have it as a pet, an exotic pet. It's a wild animal, not really trainable, maybe not tameable in the same way that a dog or cat's not domesticated. And it's in a new location. So that's why we would call it exotic. An exotic pet would just be when we are owning it, we're taking care of it. So the pictures I've included here is just exotic. When I think of exotic, I think of tropical, right? We don't have tropical here. So there's palm trees. Lots of the animals that might live in those areas would be maybe exotic birds, parrots, and small birds like that. Sugar gliders, those are pets, right? I've seen people owning those. It's an exotic kind of animal, not from Canada, so we would consider it exotic. Pythons, these ball pythons are a very common pet. They're not from Canada whatsoever. They're definitely wouldn't be considered wildlife here. None of these animals really would be. So that's why they're falling in the exotic category. Hedgehogs, tegus, which are actually the tegus are an invasive species in some locations. So these are all exotic pets. People have taken them from their natural environment where they'd be considered wildlife to a new home, I guess. So commonly released pets, these are all exotic animals. The invasive species we're going to talk about today, these were all exotic pets. They would fall into that category. They have, from wherever they were maybe owned or being kept before, been released into the environment at a certain point. And now, because they are not native to this area, are maybe causing environmental impacts, like they're overpopulating an area, taking up resources, too many resources from an area. And what that does is impacts the native species, so like our deer and maybe our spawning salmon, that would impact these native species, leading to individual species loss and biodiversity loss as a whole. So the invaders are going to be maybe moving in and overpopulating, creating a monoculture. So it's really, really good for that species, right? That one species, maybe these African clod frogs or the goldfish, but it's not beneficial for our natural environment. It has effects to our economy and then social systems, which we're going to go over a little bit more today. But I want to show you guys the first two invasive species that are very common aquarium pets. So I guarantee if you go to a pet store and you look, they will have both African clod frogs, African dwarf frogs a lot of the time, and common goldfish. So these are present all throughout like Canada, I would imagine BC is no exception. While they are invasive species and they are known to become invasive, it hasn't stopped the sale of them. So it's a tricky system. It leaves it up to the pet owners, right? So if you were to go buy these African clawed frog or common goldfish, um, we might not understand the full extent of what that species is able to do if we release them. Um, so yeah, these are kind of cute little frogs. They're super common. People like to do up aquariums, and I don't mean to pick on the aquarium people if you're fish keepers, but um, it's really important because these are so common when you go to a pet store. Where are they going if you're not able to take care of them after? Maybe you put your goldfish into a pond on your property, and that pond flows into a lake, a bigger lake system or a river system, and that goldfish, maybe someone's put in a group of goldfish. If the conditions are ideal, which they are in lots of places in BC, they might be able to overpopulate, reproduce, takes up the environment, the habitat, the prime resources like food and habitat space and maybe sunlight, nutrients from other native species in that area. So that has happened definitely in BC. And if you look up photos of invasive common goldfish, you'll see some very interesting shots on there. Next up, we have the European rabbit and a red-eared slider. So the red-eared slider, they kind of would fit in with the aquarium trade. They are, super common. I think people will keep them as pets. Typically, some people will like to stock ponds in their yards, right? Like with maybe the same thing with the goldfish. So that's where you see these red-eared sliders coming up there all over on the coast. You can see them out there. I don't believe we have them in lots of the areas here in the Kootenays. They are definitely present in BC and are have spread, and it's probably with the help of humans moving them, right, that they're able to spread so easily. You might notice it looks a lot like our native Western painted turtle. And that's a really common misconception why maybe people might be releasing the red-eared slider into like a lake or a river system or a pond is because it looks like a native species here. So with that, people are assuming that it's natural and it's fine to release them. What they do is they'll enter a waterway or a pond, and it impacts of course, the Western painted turtles that live in that area, any of the aquatic animals or aquatic fish, right, like the amphibians, frogs, and that sort of thing that would naturally be there. So turtles will eat fish, turtles will eat plants. Turtles are quite versatile in their diet. So that would take away a lot of the food from our native species while also removing native species at the same time. They're super cute, but definitely shouldn't be putting them out in the wild. This one here is present all over the coast as well. It's a lot warmer out there, so that's why we might see a lot more invasive species in those areas. In the East Kootenays, we do get quite frigid winters, so lots of these species, maybe like the African clawed frog, it might not be able to survive in lots of the areas here. The goldfish, same thing. Like if it's, they can survive very cold temperatures, maybe not frozen solid temperatures, but the European rabbit, present, Vancouver Island, Triangle Island, Southern Coast, and in the Okanagan. They're also present in Alberta. So here in the East Kootenays, we're pretty close to them. It's something to be cautious of if we were to have European rabbits maybe be moved and enter into these Kootenays, what that would look like for burrowing animals in our area or grassland, smaller animals. So I learned that rabbits they're not in a rodent category. They're not the same as rats or mice. They're more like maybe like a hedgehog, right? Like, so what I'm saying is they are going to be a lot bigger, and they might have a lot more skills, more adaptations that allow them to become expert reproducing here, or yeah, taking up the forage or grass plants that our native species would really be feeding on, grazing on. So they are cute, but they were, both of these, the European rabbit and the red-eared slider, were released as pets. That's how we first seen them in the environment. The European rabbit, for its fur, could have also been kept, and then it's like escaped or been released by people who were breeding them. And they are super, we all know rabbits, they're super good at reproducing, right? And they're pretty quick. They end up probably attracting a lot of predators to an area, so that's the reason we won't want European rabbits in our city. I think they have issues with that in southern Alberta, right? The European rabbit will become like a wildlife attractant, so that's kind of how it might affect human social systems. The red-eared slider, of course, affecting the environment and fishing opportunities. They're pretty tricky, pretty quick. Two more I wanted to bring up here was the Burmese python and the American bullfrog. So the Burmese python, it's not present in Canada as a reported invasive species. We don't have an issue with them. However, in other places, especially in the United States, they are an invasive species of concern. They are known to prey on like rabbits, rodents, mice, small animals. Really, what they would be doing is lowering biodiversity in whatever area they feed in. They take so many, they grow so big and take so much prey that it would be just devastating for an ecosystem if they were to come in. They're not native to our continent. They're not from here. They're more like a tropical. They would be an exotic pet, right? And that's what they have started as. The Burmese python was an exotic pet. People have released them, I think, down in Florida. They are, people will catch them and they're just massive. They will like constrict something, constrict their prey, so they're not venomous, but they're a pretty kind of intimidating invasive species. So what could that happen in Canada? Who's to say? They survive much better in warmer climates, so that's probably contributing to why we don't necessarily have a Burmese python issue right now. But who's to say if someone brought a whole bunch of these pythons up and released them into a certain area, they could potentially have an impact on the environment, having an impact on us as well. Next up, we have the American bullfrog. You might be familiar with him if you've seen us at any farmers markets or EKISC events. So the American bullfrog, he is a funny little guy. He looks very similar to a lot of native frog species we have in BC, but he is not from here. He's not from Western Canada. He has a very large appetite, same with maybe the python, and isn't picky with their meal. So he will eat all kinds of things, fish, other frogs, other small animals, birds off of the shore, I've been told. And they grow quite large compared to lots of our native species. So same with the Burmese python. You know, these invasive species, they have an advantage over lots of our native animals in that they're able to grow so big, and as a result, right, taking up way more resources than our native species would. So considering they're both predator animals, they would have a definite impact on any of the native prey animals we have in the area. They also have potential, all of these invasive species, right, including the European rabbit, red-eared slider, the clawed frog, and the goldfish. They all have potential to introduce new diseases or pests to our native species that we haven't evolved with, or our species might not have immune defenses against. So it's something to be very concerned about, because if we were to, say, wipe out large populations of our native frog species or native garter snake species or native, rabbits or western turtle species, what would that look like? Chain reaction for the environment. Like we want to avoid these things at all costs. So that's just one reason why we need to be mindful of what we're introducing into the environment. These bullfrogs were released by humans to Western Canada here through the food industry, but also through the backyard pond stocking industry. So like buying like an animal like these frogs or a turtle as you would a plant to put in your pond for your enjoyment. So they look pretty, but from there they have escaped. Unfortunately, that's what happens when people release pets into the wild. Another one is domestic and feral cats, and this one I might catch a little bit of flack for. These are not exotic in the same sense that the previous species were, but it's really important to mention because they're not a native species to this area, like to our in the East Kootenays, for example. So many feral cats and domestic cats, outdoor domestic cats, are contributing to biodiversity loss in the same way that invasive species are. So are they falling in that category of released pet gone invasive species? It's a little bit controversial, but like the evidence has shown that cats are contributing to the loss of native birds, animals, reptiles, amphibians, small animals like that. So it's not only become an issue with released exotic pets, but maybe our more domesticated, typical pets are also impacting in the same way. So what does that all really look like for the animal that's been released? That's a really kind of missed point when people are releasing these animals, because maybe they're putting their python, their frogs, their rabbit, the turtle, they're releasing their goldfish into a new environment, and from their side they might be imagining that it's a very positive thing for the animal. However, it ends up a lot of the time in injury, in death, in very poor living conditions for the released animal. So while they might seem to be thriving, a lot of the time maybe they aren't, and it's harmful to that species. The the misconception that humans can, manipulate the environment and release their goldfish or release their frogs and have it be a positive thing it's very like it's very touch and go. Like you can't plant maybe certain plants in your garden if they're not from here and they're going to spread in that same way. Maybe introducing a native species is going to have the effect you're looking for. So like if you had a Western painted turtle for some reason, or you had, you found maybe these native wildlife animals, that a native garter snake or a native frog, and you had them as a pet, maybe in that scenario, it's best to release them. The difference is the education that you might have or the background knowledge of those animals you might have in that scenario. So knowing what you have, what kind of animal you're working with. Are we considering, is it wildlife or is it an exotic pet? Is it an exotic animal? So education is really the most important part here. Why does it happen? There's no simple explanation. Maybe it is that education, right? So both from pet owners and the pet industry, the exotic pet trade, We need better understanding of the animals we're working with, the animals we're dealing with, and we need better awareness of maybe our environment around us and what it needs from us and how our influence is affecting that. So the key to addressing the invasion threat of exotic species is learning more about the socioeconomic forces that drive the massive growth in the exotic pet market and the socio-ecological factors that underlie released pets by owners. So why why is the pet industry so big? Why is the exotic pet industry so big? Is it because there's an economic factor playing into that? People are the driving force here. And with that lack of education, are we going to keep supporting these industries or keep supporting the misinformation from these industries? Because it's an unregulated thing, right? Like to buy and sell a lot of these invasive species is prohibited, but for example, like the goldfish or the African clawed frogs, like they are for sale in BC. They're completely attainable. Like you can access them pretty easily in our province. So, like, why is that? Do we need to have more informed decisions as pet owners, as people who are passionate about invasive species? So it's really not the fault of the animal itself. Unfortunately, it's the people. And I don't mean to point fingers at any pet owners. Like exotic pets are a really special thing, and I think people with the right care can own them properly. But it's just when we're crossing that line of introducing them that we have an issue. So factors that might influence that is, cultural pet keeping traditions. So different areas, people might keep different pets. They might do different things with their pets. And we've seen that maybe down in Florida, they have a lot of different animals that have been introduced and released there. It might be different access and it might be different pet keeping methods that exist in that area. Same with different locations, like different continents. The exotic pet industry is not it's not singularly in Canada and North America. Like this is a global trade, which is why we should all be very aware of what's going on and very kind of conscientious of what we're doing to educate about that. So gaps in our understanding of the exotic pet trade must be addressed in order to implement effective policy solutions. So advocating for better pet care or maybe better understanding in the pet stores of what they can do if they're released. It's really hard because there is the financial drive behind this. We aren't like certain companies aren't going to just stop producing or selling something because there's some social backlash. Maybe there needs to be like legal action. We need to start advocating for better awareness from all sides. So the management options are kind of where it becomes a bit tricky because everyone has different opinions, everyone has different kind of methods and management solutions. So we like to categorize in invasive species work management and control options by mechanical control, which would be like mowing, pulling, or tilling, invasive weeds, for example. We also have chemical control, which would be the use of chemicals like pesticides or herbicides to control an invasive weed or an invasive animal, for example. I think in some areas they've used pesticide water treatment to control certain aquatic invasive species. So that's an example. And then the other control method would be biological control, which is using another living thing to control the invasive species. So here we have just kind of some more branching off from that as well. What are the management options with exotic released pets that have become invasive species because they are pets, like, and lots of people are looking at them from a, like, it's a pet and it's a living animal, it's a living thing. And it can be very tricky knowing what to do with those animals, how to remove them from the environment if they're causing those economic, environmental, or social issues. So physical control is probably, I think, the most common way to remove in lots of these invasive species. So would be like physically removing, say, maybe a bird nest and eggs from an area, or making a habitat like uninhabitable for them, like let's say like changing a waterway. Um, that would be an example. So frogs maybe are not able to keep breeding in this one area. Preventative control and reporting, that's probably the next most important and most common method of managing these invasive species, because if we can prevent their presence in an area, we can prevent them from reproducing and taking over that habitat, becoming an invader, right? So if you see something, say something. A lot of the invasive species work is it's community science based. So we need people who are out in the environment to be aware maybe of if there's something going on. How do they report it? Who do they report it to? Which we'll go over at the end. Cultural control is another one. So that's changing our human habit and behavior to lessen the impacts. So including education and awareness. It's kind of, it seems like a tricky one because changing habit is very, very hard, and especially when things are like the norm. I think for years and years, especially with the goldfish, I'll keep using them as an example. With the goldfish, they've been like a typical pet, like it's a childhood pet. And I think I've heard it very commonly, like working with pets and I worked a little bit in the pet store and a pet industry kind of business. So I heard it a lot, people releasing their goldfish. You're getting goldfish to put in their pond, or getting goldfish to kind of, yeah, introduce into a new area, regardless of if it was a wild area or if it was an, on their property controlled environment. I think changing that habit is very hard because it's been a long-term habit of ours. We haven't kind of all realized yet what the issue is with introducing these new species, because it seems like a harmless pet, but those goldfish are part of the carp family. They grow quite large, right? So that's what I'm getting from this. These invasive species are growing so big and are such expert reproducers that they are taking over. The last method on here, I mentioned it previously, the chemical control. So that's what I was saying. Like, chemical methods might be used to kill the invasive species. So maybe in the scenario of like rabbits or the frogs or the snakes, even, there's chemicals they can introduce into the environment for which might inhibit like reproduction, or it might kill off those species. The only issues are is that might affect our native species. So in BC, I think we're quite picky with what sort of control methods, chemical control methods we use, which is probably a good thing. But just to be aware, that is another control method that they use in other places, because the East Kootenays, BC, Canada, like, we are not the only location dealing with these issues. It's pretty worldwide, I would say, at the moment. But yeah, before we end, I really just wanted to kind of go over here. Let me stop screen sharing. I just wanted to go over the control methods a little one last time, like the management and awareness. The reporting is a really big aspect of this invasive species work. So reporting invasive species in the environment out and about. You're on your hike, you might go to a lake, you see all these invasive American bullfrogs or suspected American bullfrogs. What might you do in that scenario? Maybe you don't want to go collect them all and remove them yourself. We wouldn't really advise that. Rather, just reporting. So you can do that through us, the East Kootenai Invasive Species Council, through our website. There is also an app in BC. So I believe it's called the Report Invasive Species app. You can download that at the App Store, iPhone, Android. Using that to report your invasives, it's super effective. It's a real person that goes out and checks those locations. You can also report through the Canada website, British Columbia website. They have a phone number, I believe you can call, and also an emailing sort of service that you could report on as well. Yeah. Thank you very much, everybody.